Welcome to Mosaic's interview series, Musings with Mosaic. On today's episode, we're delighted to have with us Miss Yamini Aiyar. She's currently a senior visiting fellow at the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown University. She had earlier worked as the president for the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, one of India's leading multidisciplinary think tanks. She also serves on multiple advisory boards. Some of them include the Weatherhead Center at Harvard University, the United Nations University, and the Ashank Desai Center at IIT Bombay. Her work has been published in multiple journals and she's written for multiple newspapers. Some of them include The Mint, Deccan Herald, and Hindustan Times. We really hope you enjoy today's insightful conversation. Hi, Ms. Iyer. Thank you for joining us today. Your book, Lessons in State Capacity from Delhi School, has ignited some very interesting conversations and questions, some of those that we'll be discussing here today. So, I'd like to start off with the origin of this book. So, when you started writing it, what was the exact target audience in your mind, and why did you specifically choose Delhi schools to understand state capacity in the education sector?
Thank you. First, thanks, Gauravi, for having me. It's such a privilege to be here in conversation with you, and really excited to take this discussion forward. To your question, I have this book, in some senses, was a coming together of some of my own experiences as a policy practitioner. When I first started thinking about these questions of the Indian state and how it responds to basic needs of citizens, it was really in the context of being an individual who sort of grew up in the years of liberalization. I became I think mine was the first generation that entered the world of work as young adults post the 1991 reforms in the late 90s, early 2000s, when in kind of cosmopolitan India, we were celebrating the exit of the state, because so much of what 1991 symbolized was this moment of freeing India from the tyranny of the license Raj. India grows at night while the state sleeps, and a sense of opportunity that was beckoning us, because we were moving away from the old hangover of license Raj and socialist Raj to a market oriented, forward looking, globally integrated economy. And I was really motivated by the idea of being part and parcel of this process, not as much as a beneficiary by joining the private sector or kind of contributing to a lot of the new opportunities that were coming up at the time, but by being a facilitator of this change for a larger group of India. And because we were so much in that framework of India grows at night while the state sleeps, really the place I found myself in was in looking at the nonprofit sector, at the NGOs, at civil society organizations, as a space where I could both develop my understanding and make a contribution. And of course, once you stepped away from the buzzing opportunities of cosmopolitan India, I found that a vast majority of the country was waiting for the very state whose exit we were celebrating, waiting for the schools to be built, waiting for the roads to be constructed, waiting for the health centers to come up, and in exactly the same way as we were to benefit from the opportunities of a market economy. For the vast majority of India, it was self-evident but hidden in some senses, in that moment of exuberance, that the state still needed a lot of hard work to do before it could before all of India could actually exploit the opportunities that me and my friends had. And of course, most of India was not naive about the state. They recognized its pernicious tendencies, the power asymmetry between the poorest Indian and the powers of the Sarkar Raj, the Mai Bap Sarkar, were very well entrenched and understood. But there was also a recognition that the state just had to do better, because absent the state, these very fundamental basic rights of citizens would not be met. And it was in that moment that social movements began to play a very significant role. Partisan politics didn't play this role in the same way, but social movements did, in both kind of building bottom up pressure on the state to do more, but also creating sites of accountability and claim making for citizens to place pressures on the state to deliver on what were basic citizen socio-economic rights of all citizens. And I became very deeply influenced by what I was seeing on the ground and began to engage with this very important moment at which notions of citizenship also were being reimagined within a democratic context. That a democracy affords citizens the right to place claims of accountability on the state, and in some senses, the job of us as the privileged was to work towards empowering these sites, these spaces, the Gram Sabha, the community organizational space, where citizen and state could mobilize. And it led to very important legislation: the right to information, the right to work, the NREGA that came out of it, the right to education, and so on. But in all of this work, the one thing that kept striking me again and again was, in some senses, the bottom up pressure was placing demand on the state to some extent, but the state itself was just not being able to respond. In very simple ways, I'll give you an example. We were working with a parent teacher association in Madhya Pradesh for some years. Um, and one of the very simple things that they wanted to do was to fix a broken roof in the school, so that during the monsoon season, when children would come to school, the classrooms wouldn't get flooded and the teachers wouldn't have an excuse not to show up. But the structure of the state was designed such that the actual powers of both money and resources to shape expenditures in a way that met what people needed on the ground simply just were not. It's a very centralized state. And so I began to think a little bit harder about, how the state is organized, and what is it about the structure of the state that prevents it from being responsive. So these bottom up pressures are being placed on the top, and the state is not being able to respond. And I think it was this collective perfect storm that also created a deeper sense of disenchantment with the possibilities of what the Indian state could do. And over time, I began to see how the influence of technology too was being deployed to bypass the state or try and find ways of surveilling the state, centralizing authority and surveilling the state at the grassroots level a lot more, which had this counterproductive consequence of closing off these sites of engagement in the first place. So I felt it was very important to try and understand better what actually was happening at the grassroots of the state. And when I began to look around in the literature, um, I found there was very little work in the Indian context that actually examined this implementation challenge of the state from the state's perspective, or from the perspective of the state as an institution. And in fact, a lot of what civil society activism was doing at that point, which was kind of building the groundswell of mobilization, um, uh, didn't really have the space to engage with this question, and the larger policy and political class too was not engaging with it. So I joined the Center for Policy Research in 2008-9, and we began this project called the Accountability Initiative that really was trying to unpack the black box of the implementation state, the administrative state, what it looked like, where powers and resources were, how they flowed through the system, how it aligned, how it enabled decision making or didn't enable decision making. And education, school education, became the site through which I was trying to study this. It was also a very important moment to think about these questions, because on the one hand, we had the right to education that had been passed. On the other, we were beginning to recognize, in no small measure thanks to the yeoman work that Asar Center did on kind of bringing out this issue of learning outcomes, that we've created a school, we've hired to some degree the teachers, and yes, there are accountability questions in terms of the teachers' presence in the school. But even when all things align, there's something about the teaching learning dynamic that is creating a context where 50% of children in standard 5 can barely read a standard 2 text. So there's something about the entire infrastructure of the school system that is not enabling learning outcomes. And ultimately, the whole goal of an education system is about improving learning outcomes. So it was we had one set of data that was kind of saying that the state is actually not being able to respond to what is needed on the ground. We had a right to education, and so it provided, and there was a lot of experimentation, so it provided a very important site to try and study the questions that I had in mind. We went through a process of iteration, and in 2016-17, when the Aam Aadmi Party came to power in Delhi, it became kind of, it's not to say that other states had not tried different things with education, they had sporadically over time. But what was really interesting about Delhi was, here's my city, so I have a place I know it, I understand it. I've seen these government schools. I've studied in the city in private schools. My children are going to a private school, so I have a sense of the ecosystem. And in my city, something very dramatic was happening because almost for the first time, a political party was making school education a political issue. And whatever may have happened in the end, this itself was such an important shift in the nature of our political discourse. And we were lucky enough to have the opportunity to. For this change to be taking place within our city, and therefore it provided an opportunity to try and study it. And what it did for me was, for the question I was trying to ask, how do state institutions actually change? Here we had one very critical ingredient in place, that was political will. Because usually when you talk about why things don't happen, forget education, look at air pollution. We can, I'm sniffling while talking to you because we are living in asthmatic hell. And one of the reasons why we are doing this is, why we're living like this, is because we don't have the political will to solve this very crucial policy problem that affects all our lives, including the policymakers themselves. The one thing you can't isolate yourself from is bad air. But in this, in coming back to the education story, in this particular instance, we had a political party that had actually committed itself to doing something about improving learning outcomes in schools. So political will as an ingredient was in place, and you can see through the arc of the 10 years, this more or less remains consistent with the political narrative of the party. And so it then allows me to get to the meat of what I wanted to try and understand, which is when you try and shift the structure of the state, the institutions of the state, the people inside the state, to align to a particular reform outcome, how does that actually happen? What are the constraints? What are the possibilities? Where are the sites where change is enabled and empowered? And all of this led me to the question of the front line. Again, in our popular discourse, when you think of the Indian state, we always say everyone is corrupt. The teacher doesn't show up, the block officer is corrupt, at the front line, government jobs are like a political market. Everybody aligns with local politicians and is busy doing all kinds of things that essentially then unleash the pernicious tendencies of the state, and unleash its tyranny on ordinary citizens. But I did feel that we needed to understand how this system changes. And I'm sure we'll talk about it later as we go along the conversation. But over years of studying the institution of the state and its people, I felt that we have these very overly simplistic narratives. And the only way to really understand how change happens is to be there, observing, engaging, listening, in order to shift our narratives and get a better understanding of what it takes to change so that we can actually do change at scale.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, your book definitely covers all of this very comprehensively. And I think in the past, there hasn't been really a book as such that has probably shed light on this matter. Sure, we've had papers, but not a book available to the masses. This brings me to my next question. According to you, how much of the failure in this government school sector stems from infrastructure or inputs versus political will or the institutionalization in the bureaucracy? I mean, what's of those two, what's the thing that's actually holding it back?
Well, to be honest, it's not an either or. All of these things come together to create the perfect storm. One of the big puzzles of Indian democracy is that it is a democracy that where welfare actually finds itself in the as a site of electoral competition. After all, we've all seen the constant debates about freebies at the start of every election. It's becoming more pronounced now, but it's not new. It's been there for decades. But also as a new nation, in the 1950s, that we invested in higher education rather than mass education, which is also a very unusual choice that for a nation to have made. And yet this reality doesn't always find its way into the broader political kind of framework. And if you look at the history of the evolution of school education in India, the two most central players actually in shaping and scaling mass education, which we really only began in the 1990s, One was civil society organizations, and the other were bureaucrats. Yes, there were some. Tamil Nadu, for instance, has a history, a political history with the midday meal scheme, which is a very important player, ingredient of what enabled universalization of school education. Kerala has a very different history of its own historical pathways, where education was prioritized, even in its pre-independence, but in more general terms. So, the absence of political will has been stark and significant if we look at it as on the national scale. And in fact, and I think that has been one of the most critical missing factors in really addressing the challenge of improving quality education in this country. Um, which is kind of why ARP was unique in the sense that here is a political party that actually built out its political legitimacy on the back of, or rather, one of the most critical ingredients of what it's built its political legitimacy on was school education. um, Without political will, things don't happen. And so I don't think it's an either or, it's a necessary ingredient. But a lot of my work shows that while it is a necessary ingredient, it is not sufficient. I begin my book with a story of Bihar. In 2005 to 2011-12, in the first phase of the Nitish Kumar chief ministership, the JDU chief ministership in Bihar, school education for those first term and a half was a very central priority of the government. And because it became a issue of political will, a lot of very critical infrastructure foundations were built in that phase. That included building schools, hiring teachers, reducing the number of out of school children, particularly girls, the famous cycle yojana for secondary schooling that then kind of spread all over, giving cycles to young girls so that they could get to a school if the school couldn't reach a student. All of that came about on the back of significant political will. And I was in this phase. I happened to be in Bihar as a sort of fly in the wall of a meeting that Pratham, the NGO that was that was working with the Bihar government on school education, uh, was having with the government. And the conversation by then had moved to the next phase, which was, we've got the infrastructure going now, but of course we recognize that that is a necessary but not sufficient condition. What can we do about improving the quality of learning in these schools? And the puzzle was framed on the back of an RCT that effectively showed us that the teachers and the students in a summer camp with a particular set of pedagogical input and a particular way in which the school was, or the students were organized by learning level rather than age grade, in these summer camps were teaching the students in such a way that we saw fairly significant improvement in learning outcomes. But the same teachers and the same students back into the school in its routine, and despite the same kind of training inputs and pedagogical inputs, were not being able to make advances in learning outcomes for those students that were not part of the summer camps. So this was the big puzzle. And in the course of unpacking this puzzle, the chief secretary at the time and the education secretary, in the course of the conversation, made what I thought was a very important remark. They said, we know how to do the summer camps. We know how to do things in mission mode. But if you want us to routineize it into the everyday operation of the bureaucracy, that's where it fails. And, and on further probing, the general theory of change, in some senses, that they had, the theory of failure rather that they had, was to place the blame on the front line. Teacher doesn't show up, teacher is resistant, teacher is one unwilling, there is corruption, there is incompetence, there is apathy. And yet I kept thinking to myself, but in fact, when you give the right kind of inputs and you align both the opportunity, the inputs and the motivation, the same actor who you're blaming in the routine is able to perform. So it's not like technical competence is the issue here, which is kind of why I think it's very important for us to make a distinction between state capacity and state capability. That the challenge with the Indian state or the Indian bureaucracy is not just one of competence. Sure, there are certain certain kinds of policy that require expertise. Remember how many conversations we have about generalists and specialists in the IAS and the need for lateral entrance. There are certain kinds of complex policy challenges that require high levels of technical competence. But on the broad spectrum, it's not competence that is necessarily the bottleneck. It is capability, which is about the organization's ability to leverage your competence towards the purpose for which you are here, which is the purpose of a teacher is to teach and ensure that all children in the classroom actually learn. And if you look at it from that point of view, one of the reasons why capabilities don't get enhanced is because the organization kind of coheres around a very different set of purpose to what it is supposed to deliver. So if you start looking more closely at the teaching system, and this is what I began to learn when I started talking to teachers and block education officers, that in fact their daily lives seem to be organized much more in terms of responding to what is being orders of the hierarchy of the bureaucracy rather than being empowered to fulfill the purpose for which they are in the education system for, which is to teach. So in interviews with block education officers, for instance, we hear them regularly say post office paradox. Say that, sorry, we are the post officers, what I call the post office paradox of the Indian state. And when they say they are post officers, they don't mean post officers as an efficient system where you post a letter and it reaches in 1 week to Jumri Talaya or wherever it is, but as paper pushers. That we have no power, we just move paper. And you probe a little bit more. What is it that you can do in your area to improve the quality of education, for instance? And they'll shrug their shoulders and say, सरकार चाहती है तो बहुत कुछ कर सकती है मगर मैं कुछ नहीं कर सकता. I am the state, in fact, because after all, they have all the trappings of what it means to be the powerful government officer, and yet I have no power to do things. So it seemed like the organization of the bureaucracy is being aligned towards a goal of responding to demands of process of the hierarchy rather than aligned around the goal of purpose. So its capability is not being leveraged and enhanced, and that is where the failure is. Now it is possible to bridge those capability failures for infrastructure because it's an easier command and easier to monitor. It is much harder when it comes to teaching learning, which is a much more locally dynamic process about the relationship between the teacher and the child, which requires a very different kind of state capacity and state capability. And that's kind of why, to answer, to your question of is it infrastructure or if it is something else, I would argue that infrastructure is an easier solve if political will is in place, but shifting the dynamic of an organization that is caught in this low equilibrium of low capability is a much harder task for which political will is necessary but not sufficient.
Right. So you talked about the post office paradox, and actually that brings me to my next question. Because in your book you mentioned that teachers have little to no autonomy. So let's say if there were to be autonomy, that they had some free run as to how to function and teach students. Um, how can we build a support system in that scenario where let's say it would not descend into either chaos or complete neglect from the state government? How would that work?
Well, look, the way to think about it is this. Uh, in public finance, we have something called the principle of subsidiarity, which effectively is a principle of that which can be done by that level of government must be done by that level of government. But this doesn't mean that everything should be done by that level of government. So if you think about a task of or a function of government, school education, there are many things that have to be done, many tasks, many activities that have to be done in order for the final outcome of teaching learning to actually be delivered on the ground. That includes setting standards, designing the curriculum, determining the textbooks, determining the assessment criteria, and actually monitoring and enforcing the implementation of these standards. Then there are a whole set of things that need to be done that is around building up the infrastructure. And then there are a whole set of things that need to be done that are around the actual delivery of the task itself, in this instance, teaching learning. These are there are some aspects of the tasks like standard setting and monitoring outcomes that must necessarily in the framing of the principle of subsidiarity be done by higher levels of government. The expertise you need to design a curriculum, to ensure that there are common standards across, to ensure that there is quality baked into all of this, to ensure that the outcomes are monitored without them being influenced by local conditions and local concerns. This requires higher levels of government to play their part, and it's a very, very important part. But should this be should the tasks of identifying the right teacher, the qualifications of the teacher are the standard, but should the task of identifying of hiring the teacher and monitoring what the teacher is doing be done by something that's sitting really far away, or should this be done at the local level where the panchayat, the headmaster, the block education officer has greater visibility of who is showing up and who is not? And should the task of determining what the structure of the lesson plan every day should be the task of the state supervisor sitting far away in the state capital, or should that be given to the flexibility of the teacher who is dealing in a classroom with many different kinds of students with different learning capabilities? So the teacher should be given a very clear understanding of these are the competencies that all students should have at the end of every semester. But should I be standing there with a danda telling the teacher that you have to only teach the letter A by drawing it in the blackboard in this particular way? No, there should be, there must be degrees of flexibility. But the hierarchical structure of our bureaucracy, all bureaucracy operates on the back of hierarchies. But in our system, power is so deeply centralized because we have moved so far away from the principles of subsidiarity that decisions that should be taken at the local level are taken at the highest levels of government, which makes for all kinds of infirmities on the ground. I'll give you one of my favorite examples, which is of a school in Purnia in Bihar. Many moons ago, my colleagues and I were looking for this particular school because in the Excel sheet of the planning and budget documents in Bihar in that year, there was a category of what was called buildingless schools, schools without a building. That means that the teacher is there, the students are there, teaching learning activity is going on, which is basically what a school is all about. But the school had not yet got its building grant and hadn't made its own physical infrastructure, its own physical building. Um, we were searching for the school. We stopped at the panchayat office. They explained to us where the school was. We found it, and of course, literally there was a tree, and students were sitting there and being taught. And the reason we were chasing after this buildingless school is because they had bought fire extinguishers. Because they had received from their building school maintenance grant, because they had received an order from the school, from the district, to that this maintenance grant cannot be used for things that the school wanted, but has to be used to purchase a fire extinguisher, because a blanket diktat had been given to all the schools in that district, because these were some standards that had been set by government of India, actually sitting in Delhi, far far away from the reality of Pune. Now think about it. A school that doesn't have a building could use its 15,000 rupees for other things that might be more relevant to it on at that particular moment, including perhaps buying extra textbooks or hiring a local volunteer to support the teacher in enabling her to teach inside the classroom. But it wasn't given the power and flexibility to do that. In fact, it was told that it must buy fire extinguishers for a building that it didn't have. This is the absurdities of outcomes that you get when you do not empower on the ground. In my conversations with teachers, coming back to the dynamics of teaching learning, one of the puzzles for me kind of goes back to what the Bihar Chief Secretary and Education Secretary of the time were talking about. This issue of we can do things outside of the classroom, in camps and missions, but we can't shift them in the routine of the classroom. Because teachers are so used to being told what to do and monitored for things that are visible in this hierarchical culture, which are pass percentages, completion of syllabus. In fact, in Delhi, in the peak of the reform, the deputy chief minister and education minister of the time used to constantly say that the classrooms are victims of to the tyranny of the syllabus and the pass percentages that push the teacher to only focus on the students that are closest to the curriculum level rather than the median child that requires a little bit more support from the teacher. But one of the but what was really interesting was that this same teacher, when she was given alternative spaces outside of the classroom, would teach students very, very differently. And then I would ask the teacher, so who and spoke of that experience positively. Then you would ask the teacher, can you not apply the same methods inside the classroom? And you would see her she would have a whole set of reasons why she couldn't, because she is so embedded in a structure where she has to follow a certain way of being and doesn't think of herself as being empowered to actually enable and engage with the classroom in that way. So she always speaks of the classroom as something that is distant from her, or something that she is not able to spend enough time thinking about because she is following all these orders that are coming from above, creating this complete dissonance between the task and the purpose for which she is in the system and her own everyday experiences of what it's like, allowing her then to say to herself that I'm just a post officer being held accountable for following orders from the top rather than being held accountable for ensuring that the last child in the classroom is at least acquiring basic conceptual learning. As one teacher once said to me, I know that I need to teaching is not about rote learning, but I have to maximize my pass percentages. And I sometimes tell my children, just ratta laga ke pass the exam, I will be happy, even though I know that is not what teaching is really about. So this disempowerment of the front line in when we don't follow the principles of subsidiarity create this vicious cycle that we find ourselves embedded in.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, the last thing that you mentioned, I have a similar anecdote. My grandmother, she used to teach in a government school in Delhi, and she was an English teacher, and she would give her students a fixed set of answers that they could answer during the exam. So I mean, she would categorize her students. Okay, these guys would do well, these guys would be average, these guys are at the bottom of the tier. So the guys at the bottom of the tier, she would provide them with fixed answers that they could go and write in their 12th board exams, and they could just pass. I mean, learning was definitely not the top priority. um, my next question is, in fact, about the national education policy that came up in 2020, the NEP. Very ambitious. It looks great on paper. It talks about integrating technology and integrating arts. Um, but, like, you've spoken to tons of teachers. Do you think they're even equipped to teach students in such a manner where they're integrating technology, or perhaps they're teaching science or maths through an art form? I mean, are schools ready for this?
So I yes and no. Okay, so the thing that I really do like about the national education policy is on its thinking about early child and primary schooling, that it recognized that there is a continuum between preschool and school, which has been a big gap in the education system. And actually, if you look closely at a lot of our survey data, including our data, you can see that, in fact, a lot of children come into class one before the age of 6, because preschooling is not so easily available. The Anganwadi center is seen as a very, is separate to the school system, focusing a lot more on nutrition and kind of, early child care, as opposed to, putting in some early learning foundations before the child enters class one. And I think what it does very interestingly is to push for this merger. And you can see across the country now that, there has been some movement towards trying to create this continuum between early child and primary schooling, which I think is a very important step in the right direction. The second really interesting thing that it does is that it recognizes front and center the foundational literacy numeracy as a goal. Now, it has been critiqued for being too minimal a goal, but I think all it's trying to do, as I have understood it, is to speak to the fact that we need to have this basic foundation in place. The layers can be built on top, but if you don't have this foundation, the layers all fall flat. And if I remember right, some of the wording in the NEP more or less make this point. So it's not a limit, it's not limiting, it is setting a bare minimum standard of what we expect a student should achieve by the end of class 5, so that this problem of 50% of students in standard 5 can barely read a standard 2 text addresses itself. And one of the things that emerged out of this is Nipun Bharat, which does have a very important focus on foundational literacy numeracy. And I think that that is an important goal, a foundational goal, and a very critical first step. It's not what a school education system should aspire to eventually, but it is a very necessary foundation that at least gives us an important starting point. Um, where I think it gets a little bit muddled is on secondary schooling and higher education. Where we have ended up on the implementation of that is really pretty depressing, because there is a lot to be done. It says all the right things about rote learning and moving away from excessively competitive coaching, etc. But where we have ended up in implementation is absurd battles about history being deleted from our textbooks, rather than an engaged conversation about what we need for particularly middle to secondary education. How do we think about high stakes testing? How do we deal with the transition from school to work and school to higher education? All of which have just fallen off into this absurd political battle about the rewriting of textbooks, which could have been an opportunity and has become a political minefield. Um, but I will say one more thing. I think a lot of what we've there is a lot of continuity as much as there are ruptures in policy, in education policy. And if you look at the history, a lot of these issues around conceptual learning, around teaching, and building child-centered pedagogy, activity-based learning, Nalli Kali. Indian states and have experimented with this in different ways, in different forms, and yet there has been something deeply missing about its ability to get absorbed into the education system, into how teachers are teaching inside classrooms. And that has everything, in my view, to do with the enabling conditions not being in place, which I have talked about, the enabling conditions of a bureaucracy that genuinely empowers teachers, of a system, of a school system, including the bureaucracy, that genuinely empowers teachers and instills in teachers this sense of professional purpose towards improving the quality of teaching learning inside the classroom. And there is here, of course, a larger question, because the school system is also embedded in society. And I think that the societal consensus around the purpose of a school system. Is the child going into school to pass the exam? Of course, that's an important marker. But how do we also ensure that competencies and critical thinking is built in to children? And how much of a measure should we place on that is a really, really important societal question that needs to be built. I call it the classroom consensus. In a sense, societally, we have arrived at this consensus that the school is a place for maximizing pass percentages. The student that doesn't get through with the system is the duffer. The student that does get through is the good student, and we will focus on that good student rather than trying to understand why the so-called duffer is not actually able to arrive at a deeper understanding and acquire basic conceptual skills. And that requires, I think, a much deeper societal conversation that is missing in our debates. And here, the issue of political will matters intensely. Why is it that in this moment of reframing our curriculum, the rewrite of the textbooks has made headlines for eliminating history and rewriting history, rather than making headlines for really talking about how we teach and what it is that we as a society want our children to acquire in terms of their critical learning skills. Now, in the age of AI, I believe this is even more important, because, in some senses, AI may well be able to substitute for the rote learning capacities that we give our children. But to use AI well and not be zombies, we need to have the critical capabilities to understand good from bad information and to understand how best to ask the right question, rather than looking for the standard rote based answers.
Right. Also, while reading your book, I noticed that you referred to a few NGOs, and these NGOs have done pretty good work in this field. I wanted to understand how easy is it for these NGOs to collaborate with government? How easy is it for them to go to a remote town or a remote village and reach out to a state government school? Are the governments welcoming? Because, for example, in an ASAR survey, they would try to show if any real impact is being created because the school has been set up, you've got the teachers, you've got the students, but they're here to assess if any learning is actually taking place. So, is the government open to such collaborations?
Well, yes and no. India has a long history of civil society organizations playing a very central role in, particularly, or in shaping ideas around kind of public services. And part of that history comes from the fact that the Indian state, even from our founding moment, the Indian developmental state made certain choices where it gives second priority to socioeconomic rights of citizens, and that has kind of been one of the reasons why our political prioritization of basic public services has been low. And one of the part of it can be traced to just the constitution itself, that socioeconomic rights were placed in the directive principles rather than as fundamental rights. Part of it has to do with the history of the evolution, or of the choices that we made in the first and second plan phase, particularly industrialization, and in was seen as critical capital intensive industrialization, and that everything else would come second. Part of that capital intensive industrialization meant the state invested in institutions of technology and higher education, but did not invest deeply in mass education and other forms of social welfare. And in fact, it is through and civil society organizations then began to fill that gap. It was civil society mobilization, particularly starting from the 1970s, that brought issues of adult literacy, non-formal education, linked to issues of child labor, and through that made front and center the conversation about the urgency of building primary education for all of India, which is something that we only really seriously started attempting in the mid 1990s, coalescing at a national level into the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan into the early 2000s. And in all of this, civil society organizations played a very important role. The second thing was that political parties themselves, the spaces of electoral competition, what democracy did was to create sites through the electoral system for marginalized communities, for historically discriminated social movements to use democracy and the tools of democracy to access state power. And that's kind of the story of the 1990s, how the emergence of caste-based politics, caste parties came in, particularly in North India, as becoming a very important and central part of the political landscape. But it shaped access to state power as an end for a politics of status and dignity, but it didn't move beyond that from a politics of status and dignity into a politics of socioeconomic rights. So the electoral space did not become a space for the articulation of socioeconomic rights for all Indians. Instead, this space was occupied by social movements and organized civil society, and that's where you see the kind of emergence of the rights based legislation, which really came through these social movements and not formally through political parties and through the political landscape. So, again, so in that sense, civil society organizations and social movements have played a very, very central role in shaping India's welfare state, and that includes in shaping the dynamics of education, health, social welfare, social safety nets across the board. Um, Most pronounced in those early 2000 years of the early 2000s, when India at a national scale very seriously began the process of expanding its investments in people, focusing on human capital and building a welfare state. Over time, this has morphed into something else. um, there had always been sites of experimentation of organized civil society organizations partnering with government to innovate and to experiment and to help the government to scale, while at the same time holding government to account, because civil society's role is as is that in very very fundamental ways. I think Pratham is an interesting model, is an interesting organization where on the one hand the Asar survey brings evidence to the table to put a mirror to what we are doing in terms of the investments in education, and at the same time it is innovating and experimenting on the ground with ways in which one can address the problem, partnering with governments to explore and implement. And this kind of dynamic relationship has existed to some degree. It still exists. However, there are two new actors. There is one new actor here, which is the consultant. Increasingly, as the burden of implementation has expanded, society's expectations of what the state should do has increased, and state capacity has not been built at the grassroots level, particularly. Governments, have begun to rely on consultants, from the big four to boutique consultancy organizations to fill that gap. And increasingly now, you walk into any government office, you're more likely than not to see an army of consultants, some from BCG, PwC to smaller organizations, all of whom are essentially fulfilling the function of the state, because there is no capacity at the, particularly amongst the state cadres, the lower levels of the bureaucracy. And so, in some senses, this is not quite partnership as much as it is embedded private actors performing the function of the state, create in on account of the vacuum of capacity. That's one thing that's happening. I find that very worrying,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it decapacitates and hollows out the state in many ways. The other thing, of course, that is happening is that politically there's a lot less tolerance for um, the watchdog function of civil society and research, and so there is a almost no government likes to be told it's not doing its job well. It in more benign times, it used to be about benign, benign ignorance. You do what you have to do. I'll take the good stuff and just ignore the rest. In less benign times that we find ourselves in now, there's active allergy, that sometimes can in fact become subject to the coercive powers of the state and actively undermining the ability of organizations to perform their watchdog function well, which I think has huge repercussions both on the quality of policy and the feedback loops that policy needs to implement well, but also more broadly for democracy. So yes, there's a lot more non-state civil society, private sector actors partnering with government, trying to get things done. Um, but uh, s- but the presence of a broader ecosystem of critique, engagement, holding the mirror is now less and less active, and that is a huge loss.
Right. So actually, this brings me to my last question. The Ministry of Education was established in 1947, and it's been more than 7 decades since our freedom. Do you think India is on the right track in the education sector when it comes to government schools? Sure, our literacy rates have improved. I mean, the indicators definitely show a positive trend, but are we actually on the right track?
So I think we've made some huge leaps, which we shouldn't ignore. As you say, our literacy rates have improved significantly. Our enrollment rates have increased significantly. In 1958, it was, if I remember the number right, about 28% gross enrollment. Now is above 100 and has been so for 20 years. We were slow to begin on a war footing, investing in mass education, but it has now been 30 years and significant improvements have been made. The numbers of students completing, 8 years of schooling, and indeed even going into 12 years of schooling and entering into higher education, have more than doubled and tripled over the years, over the decades. So we have seen many leaps forward. We have seen a lot of experimentation, from activity-based learning, Nalli Kali, Eklavya's work, the non-formal education movement, the right to education, which emerged through civil society mobilization, Pratham, Asar. We have seen a live and very very active innovation to address the challenges of education. And society has evolved too. I mean, let's not forget that in the 1990s, any conversation about education would always find itself in this debate about how, large parts of India still, particularly girls, have not been at the primary level. Getting children to school was the big bottleneck, rather than improvement, rather than anything else. And society has said it wants to educate itself. It recognizes the value of education. It is seeking education, and if the government doesn't provide it, it's going out and finding it in private systems. So we, but this larger societal aspiration for for good quality education is an evolution. It's a huge progress, and it's a huge opportunity. I think our governments and our political parties have consistently failed us in not investing well in education. Even education budgets have consistently now over the last few years become completely stagnant. We are. This is not an issue that is electorally prioritized. So citizens will vote for whatever they get in terms of the basket of choices that are presented to them. But name me one political party, with that brief window of exception of what AAP tried to do, that has made education its central platform. And I'll bet you can name all the political parties that have made digitally transferred cash transfers their electoral platform and are announcing them in the run up to elections. Name me one political party that has been brave enough to say, I will double, no, I will triple health and education budgets to ensure that we invest in our people so that we can create economic opportunities for all. But name me every political party that is willing to say, I'm going to create one more cash transfer for women. Right? We have been failed by our politicians in not prioritizing education, and in some senses, we have failed ourselves as a society in not demanding this on a war footing from our governments. Yes, there's a lot more that my book talks about in terms of the structure of the education system, the hierarchies, the processes, the pedagogical questions, the assessment systems. All of these are things that society should be debating. Yet our politics has got us to the place where, in this moment where we are rewriting textbooks, we are talking about the gross elimination of history. That is actually de-educating,
Yeah.
de-professionalizing education and undermining what an education is supposed to be, than actually empowering our teachers to teach our students and to teach them well. This is where we are failing our children, and we are failing our future.
That sounds kind of depressing. Thank you so much, Miss Ayer, for this conversation. It was absolutely wonderful and very incisive. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaurav, for having me. Look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.